All right, so this is the descriptive analysis graphic organizer that is due to Blackboard on Sunday the 29th. And there is a link already in this week to where you can upload this assignment. Essentially, this is a scaffold to build up to writing up your findings. So you should be able to take directly from this into your findings. So this is the example. A couple of questions I got. One was, do I need to look up new literature? Most of the time, no. You've already done a lot of reading, and so you should have literature already that you can reference that have to do with particular codes. However, it also happens sometimes that there are codes that are emergent, that are present in your data that you've not read any literature about. At that point, it's often helpful to find an article or two to just get a sense of how people are talking about that in the literature. So for example, at one point I did a close coding of an interview transcript, and I realized that people felt like their locus of control was not internal, that it was really external. And I just had this fuzzy idea of what that was. So I had to go and download a few articles on locus of control before I could write about it. I don't expect you to download a few articles, but if you can download one article about emergent codes that you haven't read about before, it will really help you later in your dissertation and in the writing of qualifying exam 2. The second question I got was, what do I put in this box? Is it quotes from the literature or is it from my data? It's definitely quotes from the data. So this is where you place really pertinent things that people said in your interviews or from your observations, particular notes that seem to encapsulate that code. And again, I would place 2 or 3 there. So what I'm going to describe in the rest of this video is something that can happen during or after the construction of your descriptive analysis graphic organizer. Most qualitative research you'll see in the readings, they talk about doing a lot of these steps simultaneously. I'm giving them to you one after the other because it's a little bit easier to take in. But for example, memo writing, you end up often doing over the course of time, and the same with categorizing and theming your data. So it's okay to start on this early as long as you revisit it at the end. So first you want to start with the list of codes that you've been using, so you have that already in your graphic organizer. And during the latter stages of your coding process, you'll experiment with putting your codes in categories or themes. I'm sure most of you are already doing this. You're already thinking about how codes naturally lump together under larger headings. When you do this, towards the end, you're going to really finalize this process of clustering codes as you finish your coding. And then you'll finally look at your codes all together and make sure that they make sense in terms of their overarching category, all the different codes that are subsumed under that category and how they relate to each other, and also how they relate to the research question and whether they answer the research question. Then, generally speaking, I connect any memos that relate to either the code or the overarching theme to that set. And you'll see there's an optional graphic organizer you can use to do this. And again, it's optional. This is an example of that process. And this is actually a coding process that I have literally been going through over the last 2 days. So I came up with these emergent codes in relationship to my research question and then categorized them over the last couple of days. So the overarching question I had was, what were the sources of ambiguity as a group of people negotiated science education in their district? And you saw part of this data in class before. My original set of codes as I was going through this transcript included these: changes in testing, communication issues, curriculum sequencing, there's a lack of lessons for NGSS, there's a lack of materials for science, right? So these things kept coming up in their discussion. For example, they might have said, yeah, I really think the big problem is there seems to be a lack of materials. Well, who doesn't have materials? Oh, I think it's the elementary teachers, right? So this is the conversation that's going on. I created the excerpt, I coded it, lack of materials in science. In another excerpt, they might have been talking about, when are they going to be doing the tests for NGSS? Oh, I think they're going to be doing them in 17-18. No, actually, I think it's 18-19, right? So they're going through a process of trying to figure out what's going on. This is ambiguous. They don't really know what's going on. They're drawing on different knowledge to understand it. And here is this list. Now I thought this is, jumbled and chaotic. So I started putting it in categories. Things that are ambiguous, sources of ambiguity at the state level, so in terms of state policy and in terms of district policy and cultural context. All right. So you can see here where I took things like changes in testing, that goes to the state, communication issues, that's within the district, curriculum sequencing. So here is something that actually is related to state policies, but also is a process within the district. I actually left it out because I didn't know exactly where to put it, and this will happen to you. And same with lack of lessons for NGSS. It's kind of a state policy. It's also kind of a district situation. Lack of material science, however, is district. So you can see how I apportioned each one of these into their categories. So now I have a way of thinking about, for example, I can compare things like, are state policies a greater source of ambiguity, or are district policies and contextual aspects a greater source of ambiguity, right? I can ask these questions of the data now that I have it into categories. I might also break the district down into subcategories. One is district policy and the other is district culture. So that might be another way to think about how to break these down. Definitely, if you have any questions, please post them here. So as I was doing that coding process, I wrote this memo, and I want to share this with you because this is exactly the kind of thing that as you go through and code and you categorize somewhat simultaneously and maybe even more so towards the end, and then you write these memos again simultaneously and maybe more so towards the end. And I just want to draw your attention to this last sentence here of this memo. As such, there are many sources of ambiguity, but they can be categorized coherently as state policy oriented, district policy, or organizational culture, etc. So I'm calling out and writing about what I saw as I was categorizing these codes. This then can become part of my write-up of my findings, although I will want to actually check it against all the rest of the data that I would code. So uploaded into this week and also under the main folder of syllabus and all assignments is an optional graphic organizer that can help you organize all of this stuff if you want to use it. So a lot of the stuff that we just talked about, right? You've got your theme and all the codes that fit into that theme right here. Then my recommendation is taking the key quotes from all of those codes that illustrate the theme. So now you have sort of an understanding of what are the most important quotes for that theme. And then here's where you put your memos. So you can copy and paste directly your memos that might have to do with that theme or the codes within that theme. Or you can actually go to the quotes. Another way to kind of deepen your analysis is take your really important pivotal quotes and really think through how does that quote, what that person is saying represent something important that you saw across the excerpts. So for example, right here I wrote, Jenny was referring to what teachers most often ask for to support science education. Not only was it mentioned frequently in the interview, she indicated that without it there would be little reform, right? And Jenny says we've consistently asked for more professional development and collaborative time. So I chose it because it was a pivotal quote. It represents what the teachers most often ask for across several interviews, right? So here I'm saying in my memo, this is an example that happened across several interviews, but here it was, written really well or spoken really well. And something similar here, this respondent said, this is an interview, so they got the principals together to agree that 4 of those days will be devoted to science methods so they can all come together. And so now drawing across the interviews, I'm saying in order to build the resources supports needed for science, one principal leveraged his relationships with other principals, working with them to change all 3 school schedules to align the release days. So this is just an example quote of this broader process that I documented in my memo. So that is just, again, one way that you can scaffold writing up your findings, because guess what happens? These things then become essentially your write-up for that theme, and then you use these quotes as evidence. So this becomes your findings. So as you go through this process, whether or not you use the graphic organizer, here are some of the things that will help you to figure out the big picture for your findings. So one of the things is to make note of the following. Do any categories or codes seem to matter more than others? For example, do all three of your interviewees mention something? And in one case, and in another case, only one of your interviewees mentions it. So I give you an example here that every interviewee mentions substitute teachers being an obstacle to science education professional development. Most of you probably understand that who work in K-12 education, but only one of my interviewees mentioned a lack of lab space to be really important. So that tells me something, that even though lab space might make a difference, that substitute teachers might make a bigger difference. In other cases, sometimes interviewees particularly, or even sometimes in observations, people will speak very emphatically about something, like there's a lot of emotion behind it, so you can make note of that. I want to add to this slide just a couple of examples from your research to tie it in a little bit more closely. So for example, in terms of thinking about what categories might matter more than others, Vernon might notice as he goes through his action coding that a certain process emerges more often for teachers than others. So it might be something like frustrating. That might be the word that emerges the most, right? These teachers who have a social justice mindset are continually frustrated about what they're able to do within the context of their setting. All right. Thinking about Rona's data, she might seem to notice that, and because especially Rona's doing a very emergent coding set, that certain things matter to the kids more. Maybe they talk about family a lot. Maybe, in fact, you notice that they talk about friends as if they are family. And that's something that comes out over and over in every single interview. That's something that you would make note of and can definitely become one of your themes. Another thing you can look for is how the themes or the codes relate to each other. So you've already thought about whether some codes are subsumed by others. I mean, this is part of the categorization process. Thinking about, is your code set like a tree? Are there actually like way lower level, above that, above that, above that? So is there something like that going on? You may also see things that show up in relationship to one another quite a bit. So for example, I once coded a set of interviews with those action codes that some of you tried out a couple weeks ago with the ing on the end. And I used a code called resisting when teachers seemed to, in their language, to actively resist a particular policy or a particular reform. All right. So I noticed that that code came up quite often in relationship to the code for a new district policy on student discipline. So what that means is that I can talk about that in my findings. I can look at the relationships between codes. I can also look at temporal or causal relationships. So this is a figure from some of my research around how different aspects of an organizational context support or erode professional development. So what I found when people talked, and this is pulling together actually from a lot of interviews, is that a constellation of accountability pressure, Common Core, and then demographics, of course, which make accountability pressure higher in certain circumstances, led to having many initiatives, and that through that process, science is displaced. Most of the initiatives have to do with math and language arts. Science is displaced, and therefore there's a lack of grade level science specific professional development. And again, for many of you, that may seem like a familiar process. But essentially, I pulled together from a number of interviews, which is the evidence in this case, to show how these codes actually related to one another in a sequential fashion, maybe not temporal, but sequential fashion, like one led to the other. And you are absolutely welcome to draw up diagrams like this out of your data as well. When we do draw up diagrams and talk about these things, we always do it with caveats. These are things that we're interpreting out of the data, and we're giving evidence. And some may have more strong foundation in the interviews and other data than others. But we want to always be sure to know that this is that this interpretation is, what it's based on, how strong it might be, and that it is still an interpretation. So again, following those two examples, thinking about how themes and codes relate to each other, I mentioned, again, making some assumptions about Vernon's data set, that perhaps the teachers are feeling frustrated. And he may think about, okay, if this theme of frustrating is coming up over and over again in terms of an action code, what are they frustrated about? And maybe it's almost always being frustrated about other teachers blocking their efforts. Maybe it's they're frustrated about the kids. Maybe it's that they're frustrated about, just systemic opportunities to address social justice, right? One of those relationships is going to come out as being more prevalent than others. And again, that becomes something you write about in your findings. In terms of Rona's data, it may be that there comes up a continual, maybe some sets, maybe friends, like in this idea of some being subsumed by others, maybe in fact the category of friendship to these students actually is subsumed under the category of family. So family, you have, maybe your brothers and sisters, maybe you have an aunt and uncle that you talk about, but you also talk about your friends as family. So maybe that's actually something being subsumed. So that's an example. In terms of temporal relationships or chains, Mary Kay might notice some of these in terms of watching her meetings take place. She might actually notice that there are chains of events wherein a certain set of values needs to be present, and those are discussed, and those values lead to a certain decision which is instigated by a particular person every time. Perhaps maybe there's a pattern there, and then that decision leads to something else, right? So you can think about like how this district has fostered equity in terms of the funding from the foundation through a particular chain of events or particular chain of things being present. So that might be one way to look at how the big picture in terms of your data. So none of these examples, of course, you have to follow. I'm just spending some time to try to really tie it back into your experiences. Okay, so I'm just making one final couple of slides about writing your analysis section. Your analysis section is not due until February, hold on, I'm looking it up, February 5th. And this is just going to be a paragraph that you add to your pilot study proposal that you wrote up last quarter. And all of this is, of course, detailed in the pilot study assignment, but essentially I've copied and pasted what that paragraph needs to be about right here. So the idea is that basically as you do all of the things you've been doing the last couple of weeks, you just write down what you did. So the first thing I'd recommend is that you literally just start down and stream of consciousness, write down how you coded, what you started out with coding in terms of which kind of coding process from Saldana, and how you ended up categorizing, all those kinds of things. Then later you can massage it into more academic language, or you can add citations or whatever. But essentially what you need to do is detail the extent to which your approach was deductive or guided by theory versus inductive. And for most, and inductive of course is emergent from the data. So just to be very clear, deductive, and this is from our in-class lecture, so it's a while back. Deductive is guided by existing theory. We used a provisional way of doing deductive coding. So essentially you already have a set of codes and you apply it to your data. Inductive is what emerges out of the data. In vivo coding is one way to do emergent coding. Most of you are doing a lot of different ways of doing emergent coding if you're just essentially allowing the data to speak for itself. Most people do a little bit of a combination of both. That is, they have some ideas in their heads in terms of the literature or their research questions as to what they might be looking for, and then they allow some things to emerge. But the way they do it can be different. Sometimes people have the overarching categories in their heads, and they allow things underneath to emerge. And I'm going to show you an example of that in the next slide. Other people, it's just piecemeal. They know that one of the things, and so maybe I'll talk about David's research here. So one of the things in David's research, he's pretty sure might be financial aid, that's something that comes up over and over again as a barrier. So he's going to have that category or that code as he starts. But it could be that he adds codes, maybe financial aid, and he realizes that in fact, one of the other things is family responsibilities, and he hadn't, come across that in the literature, although I think he actually has. Another thing might be that when he's coding for financial aid is a big problem, he realizes that there's several subcodes that are emerging from the data. So he started out with this idea of financial aid, but he sees that in fact, it's not just financial aid, it's knowing when the FAFSA is happening. It's having, financial literacy, according to Daryl. It's having to work and not having time to apply for financial aid. I mean, there could be any number of things, right, that come up underneath this code that's emergent. You'll talk about what coding scheme you use, so you can use Saldana's language if you like. And then you'll talk about how you generated themes. And I have a couple of examples to show you, but please don't stress about writing this paragraph. Really, this is documenting what you actually did. And there's not really very much wrong way to go about it, except that you do, of course, need to use citations and also I recommend that you try to justify, like, why did you use that coding scheme? So I'm giving you a couple of examples just to give you a few things to chew on here. This is an example from one of my papers. Our goal for this analysis was to understand and document the capitals indicated by participants as activating or obstructing opportunities for science-specific professional development. This should probably sound a little familiar to you by now. So you can see that I've talked about the goal, like why would we, sort of setting the scene, like the goal for the analysis is this. So that's now the next things I'm going to say are because I had that goal, right? So I say we first coded all of the data using a deductive framework, okay? And I had already introduced what that deductive framework is. But we allowed specific elements to emerge from the data in order to understand the functioning of the capitals in context. So I give a justification. So I say, for example, we defined organizational structures a priori. So I say, like, we come in with that as a deductive category, but we allowed specific organizational structures that are salient to science education reform efforts in this district to emerge from the data. So essentially, in this case, I came in with a set of categories deductively that were pretty broad overarching categories, like organizational structures, that could cover a lot of things, right? So then as I went through the coding, I realized, okay, well, here's an organizational structure that pertains. It has to do with curriculum sequencing. Here's an organizational structure that pertains. It has to do with the way professional development is scheduled, right? So those I allowed to emerge from the data. And essentially, I'm just clearly describing those things. And notice that I've also put a couple of citations. So here's another analysis section. This is an article by Ritchie, 2012, and it is available in, the whole article is available under 8084 in the Google Docs, Google Drive. If you really want the article, just email me and I'll email it to you. It might be easier. Okay, so this author says, once I had a good overall picture of the content of my transcripts, I generated initial codes and applied these codes throughout the data. So this author actually read, I didn't put the part, but they read the transcripts over and over again several times and sort of came up with some ideas in that process that then became the initial codes, all right? Then, so it's emergent, but it's not exactly, all right? Because the research questions guiding the first and second interviews were different, I conducted 2 separate data analyses. Okay, that doesn't matter in your case. After I systematically applied initial codes to the data set, I grouped these codes into categories that cohered or clustered together, searching for themes. So this should sound familiar, or what grounded theory researchers might call axial coding. So this person's sort of tagging like, okay, this is what different people call it. You can just use Saldana. I cut apart the entire data set and reorganized it by collating items into categories. So this person is describing how they created categories, and I wanted to include this so you could see that the way that they describe it. Next, I developed themes for each interview by collapsing the categories and judging for internal and external homogeneity. We don't need to worry about that so much. But essentially, what's important here is that they revisited their interviews after they created the themes to check and make sure they were okay. That's what the person's saying. You don't need to use the fancy language, but just that they went and said, okay, is this actually, does it actually adhere to the data set?